You're listening to Procurement 6, the weekly podcast from the team at Art of Procurement that summarizes this week in procurement in just 6 short segments.
Hi there, I'm Kelly Barner, and today is Friday, August 18th, 2023.
6.
This week's Procurement 6 is brought to you by the 2023 Services Procurement Survey we are running in partnership with the team at SAP. The line between goods and services is one of the most marked divisions in procurement. But are we really managing services spend differently? If you'd like to take this quick survey, and your company tracks annual revenues of $1 billion a year or more, check out the link in today's show notes.
5.
This week's Art of Procurement podcast features Jack Freeman's session from our Digital Outcomes event earlier this year. He gave us advice about the care and feeding of the digital procurement ecosystem. One particular part of that conversation that stands out to me is a connection Jack made between the role of CPO and the potential for procurement tech startups to succeed. Let's listen.
I always find we don't have enough time in these conversations, but I want to ask you, like, what segment of CPOs are actually embracing technology from young emerging procurement tech companies?
It's a great question. I'd welcome your thoughts on it as well. I would generally give you a smaller percentage as my answer. Mm-hmm. I think I know some of these companies by heart. I won't name them all, but I think like Roche and J&J, and like there's a couple that have procurement digital garages and digital labs. So I think I can count that group on like one hand. If not, I should get to know the others, because I love having conversations with these types of folks. But let's say there's 5 to 10 like Fortune 50 that do that. And I think that's the answer. And then there's probably a tier 2 of forward-leaning, maybe younger or newer CPOs that I won't come back to the newer point, but younger and newer CPOs that get in the seat and believe in technology and thus start engaging more with the tech ecosystem, but aren't taking the time to create an entity and like a fund to do these pilots. Like I think that group is 5 to 10, if I had to guess. Mm-hmm. So one stat I looked up before the call that this is a Google stat, so this is very dangerous for me to throw this out there. I think I read that like X small percent, I'm not going to give you percent, maybe you know this, of Fortune 500 companies have CPOs. Mm-hmm. Do you know the stat?
I don't know the stat, but I imagine that it's not a big number.
Yeah. The audience will challenge me on this, but I just Googled it because I was curious on the back of this call, and I think I saw 10%, which I was shocked by. So
I think it probably talks to the level of the CPO within the organization as well, that even if a CPO, head of procurement, exists, they may be fairly layered within the organization and not sitting, amongst who you'd consider to be C-level peers.
100%. And yes, that's exactly right. And then the last thing I'd say on this front is I've always stuck this stat in my brain. I heard it a couple of years ago. It's probably still true, but the average tenure of a CPO, I think that's a real, and that's one real problem. And then we'll get to more problems in our agenda. But I think given the tenure of a CPO, are you really going to show up on day one and the first order of business is to go introduce a couple of startups that are less than 5 million in revenue?
Yeah.
Probably not. So for that reason, I think, the procurement organizations that have been around for a longer tenure, they're big. They have a formal entity that works with the startup ecosystem. Those I've seen just most often will, buy and work with earlier stage startups. And then I think as you get to more scale, B, C, D, E funded, you don't necessarily you don't need to engage with one of those procurement garages. I think the sale is a bit easier if you're selling supplier data to Fortune 500, or you're selling a payment solution or a approval workflow solution. I think those are easier sales, even if there is no forward-leaning CPO. Once you're a lot bigger and the category is more established.
Just to call out that stat, only 10% of Fortune 500 companies have a chief procurement officer. That is crazy. It both limits the total impact of procurement in companies that certainly need it, and limits the budget available to tech companies who need a high-level executive sponsor to help them grow. To listen to the full episode, go to artofprocurement.com/podcast or search for Art of Procurement and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
4.
This week's episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast features Matt Mailer, former Vice President of Procurement for Madison Square Garden in New York City. And oh, the stories he has to tell. I was a location-based services brat back in the day when I was working for one of the largest grocery retailers in the U.S. But Matt's stories put mine to shame. I guess everything is just bigger in New York City. Listeners will hear how sourcing services for a large venue like Madison Square Garden is different than sourcing for hundreds of distributed locations. The categories of services that are unique to these large venues, and the relationships he built with those providers. And how services spend offers a key opportunity for companies to hit their supplier diversity and sustainability targets. To hear our conversation and explore other episodes of the show, you can use the link in today's show notes or find The Sourcing Hero wherever you listen to podcasts.
This is Procurement 6 from Art of Procurement. To get notified every time an episode is published, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe. 3.
In this week's episode of Dial P for Procurement, I tried something a little different. I'm always conscious of the flow from topic to topic on Dial P, and the last few episodes have been really intense. We covered the Wagner Group's rebellion against Russia. We covered Tesla playing maybe overly nice with China. And we thought hard about recent risks to ESG. I felt like we needed something fun, something lighter, but that still gives our minds something to work on. I did sort of an audio review and reflection on my major summer read. It's titled American Journey: On the Road with Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, and John Burroughs, and was written by Wes Davis. Here is the super high-level Reader's Digest version of the book. In 1918, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Harvey Firestone, and naturalist John Burroughs took a long road trip in the eastern United States. They slept under the stars, cooked outside, and made their way across the country, meeting people, investigating the things that they found, and deepening their friendships as they went. This book is not just a story of their journey and friendships, but it's something of a time capsule, preserving a very unique and fleeting time in business and social history. I highly recommend the book, and of course, listening to this week's episode of Dial P to learn more about it. Check out the full episode and accompanying long-form article on the Art of Procurement website, or subscribe to the Dial P for Procurement podcast on all major podcast platforms.
2.
In other news, earlier this week, U.S. Steel rejected an unsolicited takeover offer from a competitor, Cleveland Cliffs, that would have completely upended the American steel market. The offer was rejected for being, quote, unreasonable. But bids are being entertained for all or part of U.S. Steel's operation, and there is already another active offer on the table. U.S. Steel is the second largest producer in a highly concentrated market. Only 4 companies control the majority of the volume. Acquiring U.S. Steel would make Cleveland-Cliffs the largest in the country, and they are already the largest supplier of automotive sheet steel. If this acquisition had come to pass, they would have been the only steel company in the United States using blast furnaces, the only domestic supplier of tin plate for making food cans, and the only domestic supplier of iron ore. That is quite a list of achievements. So naturally, what do we expect to hear from Cleveland-Cliffs? According to Wall Street Journal article linked in today's show notes, Cleveland-Cliffs CEO Lourenco Goncalves said that absorbing U.S. Steel's operations would create a lower-cost, more innovative supplier for manufacturers. Ugh. Join me in rolling your eyes if you've heard that before, and if it seems overly optimistic. Time will tell, and we'll be watching. Add what's going on with U.S. Steel to the list of critical market stories procurement needs to monitor, whether it is directly or multiple tiers down into the supply chain in terms of where it affects you.
1.
Before we wrap up today's podcast, I want to share an upcoming event that you won't want to miss. On August 29th at 11 a.m. Eastern, Daniel Dorr and Lois Iyecker from Supplier.io will join us live to talk about simple steps for growing your supplier diversity program. As we always do, there is a companion poll running on LinkedIn right now, looking at the most common challenges being faced by supplier diversity programs today. As of recording this, affecting long-term change is in the lead as the top challenge. Procurement plays an important role in that transformation, starting with the practical steps towards growth we take today. I hope you will register and join us. You can find the sign-up link in today's show notes or at artofprocurement.com/calendar.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back next Friday at 6 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. If you've enjoyed this pod, help us grow and tell your peers to search for Procurement 6 wherever they get their podcasts.